Big time matchup between two top contenders and guys that have fought in the past. We have Pedro, the man, Munhoz taking on Jimmie Rivera, El Terror. Matt, we talked about this fight a few weeks ago, so we'll dive back into that prediction. Of course, that bout was scrapped or rescheduled due to a COVID scare from El Terror. But yeah, we get it now, so we'll jump back into that and we'll offer up our final thoughts. Maybe we had a difference of opinion and our final predictions up at the end. Thomas Jane would be proud. We have the young Punisher, Pedro Munhoz, taking on Jimmie Rivera, El Terror, for the second time, because this fight was originally scheduled and happened in 2015. Jimmie Rivera picking up a big decision win in that fight. It was a split, and if you look at Jimmie Rivera's record, and it'll pop up on these screens because these guys have a ton of experience, but Jimmie Rivera, out of his 23 pro wins, 17 of them by decision. And he is the definition of a boxer who can wrestle. And it's a bit of an opposite. We always talk about, fighters from Extreme Couture. They're a wrestle boxer. Justin James, we saw last weekend, wrestle boxer. Brad Tavares, same thing. Jimmie Rivera is a boxer with really good wrestling. And I love that out of him. It always produces for an interesting fight. And that's a weird thing to say because out of a guy that has that many decision wins and such a decision percentage, normally you think, man, boring fights, but I always get up for a Jimmie Rivera fight. Marlon Moraes, good fight for Marlon. It was a fun one, but on paper, it was a really good one. And if you look since that fight, a decision win over John Dodson, he loses to Aljamain Sterling. That was a halfway competitive fight, though. I mean, they both went back and forth. He loses to Petr Yan by decision. I mean, the guy's the champ. And it was a halfway competitive fight. And then he beats, in his last time out, Cody Stamann. And that was the fight where, man, Jimmie Rivera's got to get a win here. And you're taking on such a good wrestler in Cody Stamann. But he was really able to just outlast him, outstrike him. And he picked up a really good win and kind of kept his standing in this division. The other thing for me with Jimmie Rivera, this guy's been around forever. And he's only 31 years old. Like, you look at the fights that he had in Bellator. He's a longtime Bellator guy, like fighting the Brian Kelleher's of the world. Names that you recognize. He's been fighting a very high-level competition for a very long time. And with Pedro Munhoz, the same thing can be said. But the thing with Pedro Munhoz is a lot of finish wins and a lot of really big statement wins. The Brett Johns fight was a great fight, UFC 227. He finishes Brian Caraway. Poor Brian Caraway. He finishes Cody Garbrandt, and listen, that was the third knockout loss in a row for Cody Garbrandt that kind of sent him away for a while. And then if you look at his losses, he loses to Aljamain Sterling, he gets rebooked 3 times, and then fights Frankie Edgar to a split decision, and I disagree with that decision there.
I did think Pedro Munhoz won that fight, but it's really interesting because he's going to have the same issue in this fight as he did in his last. And really, Pedro Munhoz is going to have this problem in all of his fights. He's the only fighter that I can remember where the commentators say, hey, Pedro Munhoz, he's kind of slow, and that's something they always mention. They're like, Pedro Munhoz, he's one of the slower fighters you'll ever see. And it's weird because he does have really good stand-up. He has great kicks, really good punching. He loves to talk about how he trains a lot with Brazilian national boxers. Now, he's never been dropped, not even in the gym, and he hasn't been dropped in a fight before. He's never been finished, which really is wild, especially when you look at the guys who Pedro Munhoz has fought throughout his career. Nothing but killers his whole run, especially in the UFC. This fight is so interesting because Jimmie Rivera, a lot of his fights come down to this. Is he going to be able to out-volume his opponent or not? Because we know how good his takedown defense is. No one is going to be able to out-grind Jimmie Rivera, and that was kind of the story going into the Cody Stamann fight. It was, okay, Cody Stamann really good at wrestling, can throw his hands a little bit. Jimmie Rivera, I can throw my hands a little bit, but I'm pretty good at wrestling too. He's just sort of the perfected version of Cody Stamann. Now, I understand he's a little bit older, but he's a better striker, and he can go out there and outstrike guys, whereas Cody Stamann really needs the wrestling. What I like about Jimmie Rivera is if he has the wrestling and if he can take his opponent down, it's just kind of an added benefit. It just allows him to bring another wrinkle into the cage where if he can just go out there and volume strike with his opponent, 9 times out of 10, he can beat them. And the great fight for Jimmie Rivera to go back and watch is the Thomas Almeida fight. And I understand, Thomas Almeida, he's fighting Sean O'Malley now. He used to be a guy people thought could fight for the title.
The Dragon beat him.
Exactly. But Jimmie Rivera, he dropped him multiple times in that fight, and it showed that Rivera does have a little bit of pop on the end of his shots. I know a lot of his wins do come by decision, but Rivera's a really good striker, and he does have great boxing combinations. And that's what this fight comes down to for me. Pedro Munhoz is probably the better boxer than Jimmie Rivera. He's the better kickboxer. I think his leg kicks are going to give Rivera a lot of issues. And I don't think Rivera can take Pedro Munhoz down because I do think the jiu-jitsu of Pedro Munhoz is not something you want to really mess around with. Here's my problem, though. Pedro Munhoz is kind of slow on the feet, and Jimmie Rivera never gets tired and can just keep on throwing volume really easy throughout 15 minutes. It's not that I don't think Pedro Munhoz is the better fighter. I just think in a 3-round atmosphere, this fight really perfectly suits Jimmie Rivera's style.
You look at Pedro Munhoz training out of American Top Team at this point, some of the best fighters in the world. And we talked about this really, really early on in these prediction videos. I want to say it was when we were talking about the fight of the night. It's been a little bit of time. But we talked about the fact that Jimmie Rivera trains out of Tiger Schulman's mixed martial arts. Tiger Schulman is one of those guys, and you're going to have Joe Rogan on the call for this one because it's pay-per-view in the States. I bet you Joe Rogan goes off on Tiger Schulman, and rightfully so, because he's one of those coaches like Colin Oyama, like some of those real underground coaches where they might not have the biggest stable of fighters, but they have really, really good fighters. And I look at the guys that have trained under Tiger in the past, Lyman Good, Julio Arce, Shane Burgos, Mike Trezano, and so on and so forth. They're fighters that might not pop off the top of your head as, man, that's a great fighter, but they are really, really good fighters, and guys that fight in somewhat similar styles. Like when I look at Good and Arce and Burgos and Trezano, well, what are they great at? They're good at boxing. They have pretty good takedown defense. For Jimmie Rivera, he has some of the best takedown defense in MMA, 92% in a huge sample size in the UFC. And the same thing can be said for Pedro Munhoz, 80% to this point. Munhoz definitely has the better submission ability. You know that coming into this fight. But Munhoz, again, on the feet, you look at the fight that he had against Cody Garbrandt. It was the hooks. He got cracked by Garbrandt. He cracked him right back and dropped him. Pedro Munhoz is a great striker. In the fight against his last time out against Frankie Edgar, didn't really have a ton of power, or Frankie Edgar had a great chin in that one. It just didn't work for him in his last fight against Corey Sandhagen. Definitely got that wrong, got laughed off the internet. But we look at this fight, I think it's an amazing rematch. If you got really excited about the fight last weekend between Diego Ferreira and Beneil Dariush, this is another one of those fights that, man, I'm so glad we get to see this rematch.
Oh, without a doubt. Listen, it's weird, especially where Pedro Munhoz is in his career right now. And I'm going to say this. If he loses to Jimmie Rivera and Dana White decides to cut Pedro Munhoz, we're going to have issues, Dana White and myself personally. Because Pedro Munhoz really is one of the elite in this division. And on his best day, can beat any guy. The most outrageous thing about the UFC's rankings, and trust me, there's a number of things that are outrageous about those rankings, is that Cody Garbrandt was ranked ahead of Pedro Munhoz right after he beat Rafael Assunção. He just knocked out Cody Garbrandt not that long ago, and I understand Cody just kind of stood there and traded overhand rights with Pedro Munhoz, but you can't forget about that performance. Munhoz, on his best day, can knock out any guy in this division.
Would Pedro Munhoz have gotten a title opportunity at 125 with a win like that?
Probably not. Now, he can't make 125, so that doesn't really matter, but I think Pedro Munhoz has all the tools to beat Jimmie Rivera. It just stylistically, Jimmie Rivera is probably going to win this fight again. And it sucks to say, but you look at how Pedro's lost his last two fights, and even if you thought he beat Frankie, he was very hittable in that Frankie fight, and Frankie was able to land in volume and win rounds that way. Same thing with Aljamain Sterling. Aljamain Sterling, I understand. He's going to be fighting for a title. Fighting him is just very difficult. He's super unorthodox, and he throws, again, a very high level of volume, which was really hard on Pedro Munhoz, who would just try to counter with single shots. Unless you're standing there to be hit by that single shot, which of course Jimmie Rivera isn't because he has such good footwork, I just don't think you're going to be able to beat him. So I like Jimmie Rivera a lot in this fight, probably by decision.
And I mean, like you said, both these guys have fought Aljamain Sterling in the past. They both lost decisions. In 2019, they both fought John Dodson in 2018, Rivera getting the win. And you look over at Pedro Munhoz having the loss on his record. And as we always like to do, Matt, with Fight Night Picks, we'll look at the Tapology votes and the odds. And bit of a shift, 733 total votes on Tapology, 54% Munhoz, 46% Rivera, 90% of the Rivera contingency going with a decision win, 76% of the Munhoz fans going with a decision win his way. If you look at the odds, Jimmie Rivera opened at -150, now at a -148 or thereabouts. This one was kind of shuffled on short notice, and if you look across at Pedro Munhoz, opened at a +130s, now at a -122. So the fans sort of going with Munhoz, the odds sort of going with Rivera, but there's people kind of putting some money in on Munhoz. I definitely think Munhoz has the, better path to a finish in this fight, and I don't think that has nothing to do with the Tapology votes. Jimmie Rivera has so many fights that have gone to decision, but Jimmie Rivera, again, really good boxer, really good at range, and great takedown defense. Munhoz has a lot more power, but I really like Jimmie Rivera in this fight.
So this is a super fun fight, and it's kind of hard to be confident in either guy when you're talking about two of the best fighters and arguably the best weight class in the UFC. Like, Jimmie Rivera, yeah, he's had some losses, but honestly, 135, I do think their top 15 is as good as any other division, so there's no shame in it. But I do think, listen, the wrestling defense of Jimmie Rivera is going to cause Pedro Munhoz some issues, because we all know how good Munhoz is on the ground, but I just don't know if he'll ever be able to get it there. I think the leg kicks of Munhoz, if he can start landing those early like we saw in the Edgar fight, they might add up, but I'm in agreement with you. I think Jimmie Rivera will be able to win decision, but this could be an amazing fight. Like, I've been excited for this fight every time they've rebooked it, so hopefully we finally do get it this weekend.
Matt, we're really looking forward to this fight. We both have Jimmie Rivera to get the win. It should be a great card headlined by Biggie Boy, Jairzinho, Rozenstruik, et le bon gamin, Ciryl Gane representing France. Should be a great one. Really look forward to it. Keep locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. As we always say, let's get into it.